Here's another important dude with a good title, senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast, Eli Lake. And boy, you are important these days because there's so much to talk about. Thanks for joining us this morning, Eli.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So we just heard the ABC News report at the top of the hour with regard to Israel announcing the complete and total demolition of those tunnels, that vast network of tunnels that Hamas had created. Mission accomplished as far as Israel's concerned?
Well, depends on how you define that. I mean, I think that there's a growing chorus of voices in Israel that says not necessarily that Israel should reoccupy Gaza. I mean, that I think would have little support except for those on the far right, but certainly the idea that Hamas should be dealt the kind of blow where at least that their leaders are driven from Gaza and there's an effort to try to bring in the Palestinian Authority. I think that this is the third war with Hamas since they took over Gaza. And from the Israeli perspective, and I think from the world's perspective, the question has become, is all of this bloodshed worth it when it ends up delaying what appears to be the next conflict, which usually gets worse in a lot of ways, although certainly Pillar of Defense in 2012 was not as bad as Cast Lead. But is it worth it? What was the strategic aim? I think in this case, the strategic aim was to destroy the offensive tunnel network into Israel. But Hamas was able to improve the range of its rockets. They were able to place those rockets, which they launched from civilian areas, which Israel responded to, which exacerbated certainly the number and increased the number of civilian casualties when Israel responded. And it was able to build these tunnels into Israel all the while Israel was monitoring its northern border. And for the last year at least, you had al-Sisi's Egypt closing pretty much the southern border. And even under those circumstances, Hamas was able to improve its ability to make war on Israel. I think that is going to sort of lead many. I think Benny Morris, the great historian, wrote about a week ago that not this round, the next round will be a war to destroy Hamas, not just a war to destroy its tunnels.
That's really interesting. What about the political fate of Hamas? Is there any possibility that, they could lose favor and a more moderate, ruling group could come into control there?
When I was in Gaza about a year and I guess you'd say 17 months ago, my impression was, and this was not a time of war, was that there were a lot of Gazans who blamed Hamas for the isolation of Gaza, and they've only grown more isolated. But there hasn't been a Palestinian election for nearly a decade. And Hamas, it did have an argument the last time they won those legislative elections in 2006 that they were less corrupt than the den of thieves known as the Palestinian Authority.
Yeah.
And I think that is, we'll see if that's still true, but I think that is something that they have going.
But no blaming of Hamas within their own area, that they are behind, they're responsible too for all the civilian deaths.
Well, but see, this is the problem, is that whenever a population is under siege like the Gaza is, and there's one party that's dropping the bomb, there's one party that's shelling, where returning fire in a lot of cases. I don't think that it's realistic to expect that population to blame the so-called resistance fighters. But that said, Hamas, living under Hamas is terrible. It's arbitrary in the sense that there are many Hamas top officials and people connected to them and their families who live very well. There's appalling poverty, only a few 100 yards away. So the conditions are certainly there, but as long as it's understood that Hamas will remain in power, then any chance of anybody rising up against them is very slim, because the way they treat operators is terrible. I mean, there were videos about a year and a half ago of so-called collaborators being dragged from the back of motorcycles through Gaza City.
Right.
Now, I mean, that sends a message to everybody. It's pretty intimidating.
Eli Lake is joining us. He's the national security correspondent for the Daily Beast. And Eli, many eyes are turned to downtown Washington, D.C. this week as we hold our first ever African Nation Summit. John Kerry yesterday. Oh, did we lose Eli? We sure did. I'll go ahead and tell you what I was going to talk to Eli about. John Kerry yesterday, Secretary of State for the United States of America, spoke at this summit, and many of us were hoping that a thrust of this summit would be to discuss with these African nations what they are doing and what we could potentially do to help them in the effort to push back on radical Islamic terror. We saw the horrible situation with the Boko Haram in Nigeria. Of course, we know about Somalia and Sudan. And it seemed that John Kerry's main focus yesterday had to do with, well, climate change.
And President Obama's and many other leaders' goal to go to Paris and get a global agreement with respect to the reduction of greenhouse gases.
So that's his focus, climate change with Africa, and we're going to get tough on Putin with regard to his greenhouse gases. Is there any talk so far, or planning on having any talk in this African summit, Eli Lake, about actually helping them with regard to the real threat of Islamic terror within those African nations? Eli?
Yes, can you hear me?
Go, yes.
Okay, I interviewed a guy who is the chairman of the largest arms manufacturer privately held in Africa, and he said his message in this summit, he came from South Africa, was basically there needs to be looser restrictions on kind of emerging African governments like Kenya, Mali, Nigeria, so that we can sell them more advanced weaponry so they can defeat their own insurgencies. We haven't seen anything like that in terms of the Africa Summit. The people invited, that they've emphasized food security and climate change and all of these other kind of soft power issues, where I did think it was interesting to talk to somebody whose point was, listen, this summit should be about trying to better equip and create an indigenous defense industry for African states that are fighting against these outlaws.
Eli, what do you consider to be the biggest threat in, say, northern Africa? Is it the threat of a growing presence of Al Qaeda, or is it Ebola virus in Africa? What do you think is the biggest problem right now facing Africa?
Well, I hadn't really thought of that, but I do think that the fact that Al Qaeda has taken advantage and other extreme Islamist groups, or sort of political Islamic groups that are fanatic, take advantage of what's known as ungoverned spaces, and there are quite a few ungoverned spaces in Africa. I think that really does present an enormous threat. And, when the regime of Muammar Gaddafi fell, that meant that many of the stocks of weapons in Libya ended up in the hands of these insurgent, militant groups, and that, created the insurgency in Mali, and, we probably are going to see some of these surface-to-air missile launchers end up in, who knows where, but certainly all over the region, and I think that is a huge problem as well.
All right, Eli Lake, Daily Beast, thanks so much for joining us this morning. So much to talk about with Eli. Thank